How much is closing costs on a house? Well, hey, I'm glad you asked. And just like always, that's a great question. So we've actually shot a couple videos recently on closing costs, and we'll point you to those at the end. But the important thing to note for right here and now is that closing costs are a significant expense, and therefore they must be planned for and budgeted for early on in the home buying process. If we've never met before, my name is Gavin Sessions with Loans Made Simple. And if you're curious to learn about all things related to mortgages and home loans, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to our channel. We post new content each week. All right, so before we talk about how much closing costs actually cost, allow me to be a bit repetitive and we'll do a quick definition on what closing costs are. So closing costs are expenses above and beyond the property's purchase price that both buyers and sellers incur, and those are paid to third parties to help complete a real estate transaction. This is certainly not a perfect analogy, but think of closing costs kind of like sales tax. So when you buy an item that has sales tax, the taxes are above and beyond the item's purchase price or the item's sales price, right? So the money that you exchange with the seller keeps for the item, but the sales tax is collected by the seller when you buy the item, and then they disperse it to the third party, in this case, the government. All right, also worth noting that if you're buying a home with cash, you'll still have some closing costs, but they'll be less than if you're buying the home with a loan. All right, so before we move on and close out this section, here's some examples of the closing costs that you're gonna see either on your settlement statement from the title and escrow company or on your loan estimate or closing disclosure from your lender. So the first thing you'll likely see is origination fees for things like processing and underwriting. The next thing you might see is discount points in exchange for a lower interest rate. The next thing you may see is fees to cover the cost of an appraisal or a credit report. Next, you'll likely see title fees such as title insurance or the closing escrow fee. You'll also see recording fees to local government entities. You'll see prepaid items such as interest or insurance, and you'll see some prepaid reserves for property taxes and insurance to help build your escrow account. All right, so now that we're done with the intro, now we can actually talk about how much closing costs actually are. So closing costs are often explained as a percentage of your loan amount, somewhere between 2 and 5%, but most closing costs are not a specific percentage. In other words, some are a hard dollar amount. So from my experience, budgeting about 2 to 3% is safe for closing costs. So occasionally we'll see closing costs as high as 5%, but that's pretty high and it's much less common. So since we don't buy and sell in percentage points, let's actually give you a real example so you can understand what 2 to 3% means in terms of dollars. So let's assume we have a purchase price of $400,000, which is close to the national average, and that you're gonna make a 5% down payment. So 5% of $400,000 is $20,000. If we subtract that $20,000 from our purchase price of $400,000, it gives us a loan amount of about $380,000. If we assume that your closing costs are gonna be about 2.5% of that loan amount, that would give us closing costs estimated at about $9,500. So quick interruption, great lenders are always gonna communicate with you in terms of cash to close or cash due at closing. And that's a combination of your down payment plus your closing costs. And you'll see that from them on either an estimated cash to close worksheet or a loan estimate. All right, so to calculate our cash to close, we take that down payment we just talked about, which is 5% of $400,000, $20,000, and we simply add our $9,500 worth of closing costs, which gives us estimated cash to close of $29,500. So simply put, if you're thinking you want to buy a house for about $400,000 with a 5% down payment, it's probably safe to assume that your total cash to close is going to be right around $30,000. Hopefully that's simple and makes sense. Just want to pause the video for a quick moment and invite you to connect with us. If you're ready to take the next step to get qualified and speak to a mortgage professional, a loan officer, or if you'd like to get connected to a great real estate agent, click the links below. All right, so now that we've talked about how much closing costs are, let's talk about where you're probably gonna see your closing costs. So likely the first place that you're gonna see your closing costs is on a loan estimate from your lender. It's part of your initial disclosures package, but in the event that you haven't found a home yet, you can ask the lender to provide you an estimate of your closing costs. That way you know what they are before you even get started. So the next place you're gonna see your closing costs is on your closing disclosure, also from your lender, and you'll get that no less than 3 days prior to closing. So at this point, your closing costs are less estimates and much closer to actual figures. One other place that you'll certainly see your closing costs is on your estimate or your final settlement statement from the title and escrow company. So if you're not getting a loan, in other words, you're buying a home with cash, that's the only place you're gonna see your closing costs. All right, so now you might be saying to yourself, dang it, I don't have enough money saved to cover my closing costs, so now what? Well, the good news is you're not the first and you won't be the last to ask that question, and there's actually several good options for you. So the first good option is a gift from a family member. So if you're buying a home to occupy it as your primary residence, most loan programs will allow you to receive a gift from an eligible donor to help with both your down payment and your closing costs. So The eligible donors would be immediate family members like mom or dad or grandma or grandpa, brother, sister. Not likely eligible would be like a second cousin twice removed. So you're looking for an immediate family member. Hopefully that makes sense. So another great option, and it depends on market conditions, but you can ask your realtor to help negotiate for you a seller credit. In other words, the seller would give you funds at closing to help cover your closing costs. But please note, seller credits have limits and they roll up to something called interested party contributions. So depending on your loan program and your down payment percentage will determine how much credit you can get from the seller. Also, super important to note, credits received from interested parties such as the seller or maybe your realtor, those cannot be used to help cover your down payment. They can only be used to help cover your closing costs. Funds for your down payment must be your own funds or they must be from a family member gift. Along those same lines, and another option is you can ask your realtor to see if they're willing to help contribute some of their commission they're earning from this transaction to help cover some of your closing costs. Another great option would be a down payment and closing cost assistance program. So most state housing authorities have great programs to help with both your down payment and your closing costs, but those don't come for free. So it's worth noting that you'll likely have a second mortgage, which has an additional monthly payment, or you'll have a higher interest rate on your first mortgage, which would give you a higher monthly payment. So great programs, but they come with a cost, but certainly worth using if you have no other options. All right, last but not least, and probably the simplest option here is if you don't have enough money to cover your closing costs, maybe you just have time to add that to your savings plan and just ensure that you save enough money to cover both your down payment and your closing costs. So as I mentioned, there is much to know about closing costs. And if you're curious to learn more, we suggest you watch this video right here, where we walk you through an actual closing disclosure in detail. Or you can watch this video right here, which further explains the difference between the down payment and your closing costs.